This is our first event in the Science and Religion Digital Dialogue series, and I am particularly grateful to my colleagues here at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, as well as our colleagues at Rice University, at the University of Michigan, and at St. James United Methodist Church in Kansas City, Missouri. I would also like to express my gratitude to the Science for Seminaries project, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. Today, I am speaking with three wonderful professionals in religion, the social sciences, and in public health. We will have time for questions, and the Q&A is available to you as a forum for you to post questions. My name is Elonda Clay, and I am the project leader of the Science for Seminaries grant here at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. I am also the director of the Dickhaut Library, and I will be your moderator for this very relevant and needed conversation. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll do a very brief introduction of our guest experts, and then we'll jump into a presentation from Dr. Fuller, which will be followed by an engaging discussion with our other panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Oveta Fuller, who is an associate professor of microbiology and immunology at the University of Michigan Medical School and a faculty member in the STEM initiative of the university's African Studies Center. Dr. Fuller also serves as an adjunct professor at Payne Theological Seminary. She is an ordained itinerant elder and a former pastor in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Dr. Emanuel Cleaver III is senior pastor at St. James United Methodist Church in Kansas City, Missouri. Cleaver received his Doctor of Ministry degree from St. Paul's School of Theology. Dr. Cleaver also graduated from the Methodist Theological School in Ohio with a Master's of Divinity, and he now serves as a trustee at MTSO. He is the author of 2 books, Pastor on Track, Reclaiming Our True Role, and What is the Bible and who is it for? And finally, we have Dr. Rachel Schneider, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. Dr. Schneider serves as co-managing director of Project Curate, a Houston-based nonprofit social justice and civic engagement organization. I thank you very much, and now I will pass everything on to Dr. Fuller.
Thank you so much, and good evening to everyone. How wonderful it is to be part of this first series of science and religion dialogue. So I'm very grateful for the invitation and the opportunity to work with my colleagues and all of you in this journey. I'm a virologist, as you heard, and have been working with clergy because I'm also a clergy member, and so I'm sort of having both feet in both of these areas. We'll try to bring them together. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started with my assignment for the night, which is to help you understand the fundamentals and basics such that you will be able to navigate this time from a place of understanding, a place of reclaiming the role of religious leaders and understanding what time we're in. I realize that this presentation, which contains aspects of things I've done in other places, may be more in depth than you will actually synthesize tonight, but that's okay, don't worry about that. What it will do is give you enough information that you will be able to come back and see the video. I hope it's going to be posted and use it in the future. So let's get started. And again, thank you to the organizers for this invitation and opportunity, and to the audience for being here. So from milkmaids to messenger RNA, trusted messengers in a time of pandemic. And this is based in part on my years of work with as a virologist in the laboratory, but also as someone who's doing implementation science, where we're moving the science into the community to fill a need. And that actually is what the trusted messenger intervention or idea that we have developed and utilized over the last 15 years is about. It's really helping religious leaders reframe community perceptions about disease prevention. And as all of us know, religious leaders are in the community and they are the gateway into the community in many cases. Even though often we think that's not true anymore, it's still true in many, many places. And so the strategy of Trusted Messenger is to use in-depth science-focused education with established networks, not individuals, but networks of religious leaders, so they can effectively and confidently address whatever the issue is. I've been doing HIV/AIDS prior to this pandemic, but now obviously we're doing this with COVID or other things that we need to do. And the premise of Trusted Messenger is that religious leaders have presence, credibility, structure, access to people and communities. These influential networks are an untapped, low-cost vehicle that can help to transfer biomedical developments into broader application. We use multiple approaches in a scientific approach, and we use rigorous science to quantitatively and qualitatively document the outcomes. And this is one publication from this work. So what I want to do tonight, my goal is to give you a solid science foundation for who you are as trusted messengers, as gatekeepers of your community, particularly as we navigate this COVID pandemic that we're in. Realizing that the end game may not be what we'd all like, which is to get rid of COVID-19, but more likely that we will learn to coexist with COVID like we coexist with flu, unless there's some other divine plan that I don't know about. So we'll talk in 4 pieces tonight. I'll give you a little bit of background to say that pandemics have always been with us and that faith leaders have always been involved. We'll talk a little bit about vaccine discovery with milkmaids and vaccines, which is just an interesting story. And then we'll get into the meat of the matter with COVID-19 and vaccines. So here's where we are with a global pandemic that was actually declared such in March of 2020, about 18 months ago. We're now at over 225 million cases and over 4 million deaths documented around the world due to a new virus that transferred from animals to human. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is not the first time human beings have dealt with pandemics. So this is just here to show you the death toll from various kinds of pandemics throughout the written history of humankind, from the Black Death, which was back in the 14th century, to smallpox, to Spanish flu, which was about 100 years ago, to actually COVID-19 and HIV/AIDS, which are with us today. And this diagram tries to use the fuzzy balls as a way to compare the number of deaths. At the initial time this slide was put together in March, it was this red area, but by now we're up to 4.6 million deaths. So that ball would be bigger with COVID-19, about the size of this one with the flu, the early flu. And we also know that clergy and religious leaders have been involved with disease from the beginning of time. We only have to look in the Bible to see leprosy and Jesus dealing with the lepers, and is also captured in artwork. Here's a picture from the Black Plague and how doctors, physicians, or those who are called upon to do medicine protected themselves. Does that look familiar? Here we have someone in a garb and a mask trying to keep themselves away from the plague or the particular pathogen that was there. And here we see a case of smallpox, which thankfully we don't have to deal with anymore. But Ramses V, one of the Egyptian kings, we know now died of smallpox. You can see on the mummy the lesions that are a result of the scars from smallpox. So smallpox has been around. And that leads me into the story of how science started in vaccinations, with the wonderful story of milkmaids and the smallpox vaccine. Milkmaids were the people who milked the cows, and sometimes they got these lesions called cowpox, like is shown here by the artist. Well, back in 1796, Jenner, who had actually been variolated, he had been given pulse from one of these lesions, as a way of trying to protect him from getting and dying from smallpox. It was just a rite of passage that people would get smallpox. As a matter of fact, you may remember the milkmaid, the fair milkmaiden from Mother Goose Tales. The milkmaiden was fair because her face was never broken out with smallpox like this, and the scarring never happened on her face, so she never had all those scars. So she was called the fair milkmaiden in all those poems. Well, Jenner noticed that milkmaids never got smallpox, so he took material from one of the lesions and gave it to a young boy, 8-year-old, and then about 6 weeks later challenged him with smallpox, with a real case of smallpox. And the young boy did not get infected. So this was the first case of vaccination with material from cowpox, which is a very related virus to smallpox. And so that evolved into a whole campaign which ultimately eradicated smallpox using a systematic injection of the smallpox vaccine. This is one of the last cases of smallpox. You can see these lesions are horrible. People are very, very sick. I have this scar on my arm from a smallpox vaccine. And if I could see you, I'd ask you how many of you have this kind of scar on your arm from getting this vaccine. And what it would do would date you, because we stopped doing these vaccinations somewhere in the 1980s when smallpox was declared as eradicated around the world. So I just share this story as an example of what science can do. And imagine how many faith leaders and religious leaders were involved in that campaign to help eradicate smallpox and to get people vaccinated so they would be safe from this disease. Here we are now in a current pandemic. This is the most recent data for USA for COVID-19. This is where we were back in March when our state, Michigan, shut down. And you see, we were so low compared to where we went. This was the summer. This was that November to February surge. And then as we came down after vaccines were available, and look where we are now, we're headed back up. As schools open and campuses open and our businesses are more open and people are, even with vaccinations, people are moving around a lot more. We still have lots of cases happening. So we're essentially where we were just before Thanksgiving last year. And what's going to happen with this, we'll have to wait and see. But my prediction is it will go up. That's why vaccination is so important right now in the US. Of all ages, all people, there are about 63% of the folks that have one dose, about 54% of all ages. That includes those who can't be vaccinated under 12, with 54% fully vaccinated. But to get to herd immunity, we need this number to be up somewhere, or this number at least up somewhere around 80 to 85%. So vaccination, which doesn't get rid of the virus, it just protects us from disease, and I'll share more about that. Just briefly, coronaviruses, which is what the COVID-19 or SARS coronavirus 2 is a natural biological event. These are called zoonotic events, where a virus in an animal moves into a human because of contact. And so we've had this before. We've had swine flu, we've had bird flu, SARS and MERS, which are coronavirus. And so we have a new one, SARS coronavirus 2, that was originally called the novel coronavirus, that moved, we believe, from bats into humans and has now caused an epidemic around, or pandemic around the world. The coronavirus infectious disease 2019 is what COVID-19 stands for. All viruses require a host cell in order to reproduce. Unlike bacteria that can reproduce all by itself, all viruses have to essentially usurp the factories of a cell in order to make more of themselves. And the whole purpose is to make more of themselves. They're not trying to make us sick. They're just trying to reproduce, as all life has to do, because if they don't, they'll become extinct, just like any other life form. So this is an infected cell, a human cell that's producing coronavirus. This is a diagram of a cell. This cell would be probably bigger than my screen if you saw the whole cell. So this is just a little bit of edge of it. These red extensions are just pieces of the cell that are sticking out. And all these little yellow balls are viruses that have been produced by this one cell. So one infected cell produces hundreds of virus progeny, which is one reason COVID-19 virus is so infectious. Viruses have to go from one person to another to continue to live. And so We know that of all the modes of transmission, from ingestion of food or water, like with hepatitis, to touching objects, to airborne, to tick or vector-borne, that COVID-19 is transferred mainly as an airborne pathogen. We breathe it in and we breathe it out. Occasionally there's infection from touching someone or touching an object that has the virus, but this primarily is its major mode of transmission. If we could stop this, we could manage COVID-19. And why is that so important? This is a highly, highly, highly contagious virus, more contagious than flu. And so I give you two examples of airborne transmission. The first one was early on. A traveler from Singapore went to France for a ski weekend with 21 other people, and or 9 with other people, and he lived with 9 people or 12 people in a chalet for a weekend, just a weekend. Out of that encounter, because he was asymptomatically shedding virus, didn't know he was infected, over 21 people were reported or traced to have come from that 2 days together of these people in the ski resort in 4 different countries. So it is highly, highly contagious. And this is an example of why our churches, many of our churches are closed, or why we talk about not eating inside or not having groups of people inside. This is a restaurant in one of the cities in China where there were 5, 6 tables, but 3 of them were along the same air conditioning flow route. And one person who was asymptomatic, not showing symptoms, was infected. That's A1. But within the next 3 weeks, all the people in the red, people in his family shown here, as well as people in neighboring family or neighboring tables in different families, ended up with the same strain of coronavirus, because it was traveling through the air conditioning flow that was flowing out from this source. And people at these tables outside of that air conditioning flow did not get infected. So this is why we know that indoor airflow can actually transmit the virus from one person to another, or help the virus flow from one person to another. We also know that COVID is disproportionately affecting people of color. This is our current hospitalizations and death rates up to September 14th. This was data back from April of 2020. You see the cases where there were stats kept, and this is Black Americans. This is deaths among Black Americans, and this is in Chicago. And then if you look at other places, the percent of the population as African Americans, say in Louisiana, is 32%. But in May of last year, or by May of last year, 70% of the deaths were in African Americans due to COVID. Or here in my home state, 14% of the population, but 41% of the deaths from COVID. So this is not affecting all of us, but following the disparities in health that some of my colleagues will also talk about. So what are we trying to get to? We're trying to get to an end game where we manage infection and disease and are able to function in the presence of virus that won't be eradicated probably, but will be managed so we can keep it at low levels. And so the things we've heard so much about are critical in stopping this airborne transmission of COVID-19 as we breathe it in and breathe it out. I'll talk about how it replicates in just a little bit. And so physical distancing, we've heard a lot about social distance. I call it physical distancing because we're physically staying away from people. Staying home if you don't have to be out, or being restricted in where you travel to. Limiting the size of gatherings. Correctly wearing a mask, covering the mouth and the nose. Frequently washing hands such that we don't self-inoculate ourselves by touching something that virus landed on. This is actually, now we know, not the most major way that virus is transmitted, but it still can be transmitted that way. I remember back in March and April of 2020, making sure I washed my groceries before I put them away. We don't have to do that anymore. And then testing to know who's infected and doing effective contact tracing and isolation if someone has potentially been exposed. And then lastly, the ongoing research for vaccines and antiviral therapies for COVID-19. So let's move into the COVID-19 story. Here again is how the virus spreads. You know, in the wintertime, particularly in cold climates like Michigan, you see fog coming out of your mouth when you talk. Well, that would have virus in it if I were, or the person were infected, and it can travel far. So that's why we wear a mask. And so masks will prevent material, as this person is coughing, from going into the air, the red dots. And there are different kinds of masks. They have different effectiveness, with one of the most effective being the N95 or the KN95, which blocks large water droplets as well as aerosols. But all of these will stop some amount of breathing in the virus that is in the atmosphere, especially when we're around other people who may be putting out virus knowingly or unknowingly, asymptomatically or with symptoms. It doesn't help if we don't wear the mask correctly, however. So let's talk about COVID-19 and vaccines. And when I say correctly, it has to cover the nose and the mouth, as well as be closed at the sides so that air doesn't come out. What this means is that a person who may be making virus in their nasal passages and mouth are not putting it out into the atmosphere like this. So it's to protect other people as well as to protect yourself from other people. Let's look at COVID-19 and vaccines. Tomorrow there's another FDA meeting on vaccine boosters. And so what is in the vial and what do we know about vaccines? We've had vaccines, as I mentioned, since the days of smallpox with milkmaids. And what vaccines do is they prime the immune response. They prepare us using our wonderfully and fearfully made immune system to be prepared when we actually see the virus. And so we can either put in a part of the virus, the whole virus, a killed form of the virus. There are many ways to make a vaccine. We have to determine how many injections we get. Do we get a booster? Where do we store it? How do we distribute it? All these things you have lived through us looking at. Then if we can get high enough amounts, there's herd immunity where there's so many people who don't get infected that the few people who cannot get the vaccine are protected from being exposed to the virus because there's really, really low levels in the society. And so we also asked, does the vaccine prevent disease or transmission of virus? In all cases in the USA, vaccines are studied for their effectiveness at blocking the disease as well as their safety. And so we are familiar with flu vaccines that we get each year that the best ones are about 70%. With the COVID vaccines, we're not putting the whole virus in. It's not a killed or attenuated vaccine. It is a subunit vaccine where we're only putting in the spike portion of this virus. So if this is the whole virus, this is its genetic material, this is the protein on the outside, we're putting in a code that actually allows cells to make this spike protein. And when the body sees that, the immune system now makes protection against this such that when we see the whole virus with the spike, we're able to deal with it and we don't get infected. These vaccines, there are many of them that are under investigation around the world, but I've highlighted the 3 that are approved for emergency use in the USA: Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. And now Pfizer is actually licensed in the US most recently. Pfizer and Moderna are messenger RNA vaccines. I'll explain that. And Johnson & Johnson is a whole virus carrier vaccine. All of them have gone through rigid studies for effectiveness and safety. And these are some links that can help you understand what they are made of. Johnson & Johnson is a defective virus from adeno that carries the gene for the coronavirus spike. So it can't cause any problems, but it does carry the spike gene, which is the surface protein of coronavirus. And I'm going to hopefully play this video so you can see how messenger RNAs work. So this is the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. And let me know, somebody shake your head to make sure you can hear the sound.
Researchers have found that the COVID-19 virus begins the process of creating copies by attaching its spikes to a host cell. Those spikes offer a target for vaccines. With the right preparations, our immune system can utilize this vulnerability. A vaccine is used to arm our immune system. It contains messenger RNA, which can direct cells to make specific proteins. The messenger RNA tells our cells to produce COVID spikes. These harmless spikes give our immune system the information needed to quickly detect a coronavirus infection and produce the appropriate antibodies. The new antibodies respond once COVID has entered the body. They attach themselves to the spikes on the COVID virus, rendering the spikes useless, protecting our cells and keeping the virus from reproducing. mRNA vaccines have been studied rigorously and are a safe and effective way to defend ourselves against COVID-19 infections.
All right, so that tells you a little bit about how this works. And so I'm just going to review what you just heard. This is for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, where what's going in is not the virus at all. It's a little fat molecule like cooking oil that has a code or a copy of a code in it for the spike protein. That's what's in the vial. It's rehydrated with water and sucrose and then injected into the arms. Once it's in the arm, it travels to certain cells. Those cells, our own cells, not a virus, take up this little lipid or fat droplet with the code inside for the spike. And on our own factories for protein makes a spike coronavirus or coronavirus spike, such that our cells now present these to our immune cells who say, oh, this is not me. Let me make a response to this because this is foreign. And so we make a response such that when we see the real virus, we already have protection against the spike protein due to the messenger RNA. This is not new technology. It's just used initially for the first time in a vaccine. It's been used for cancer therapy and lots of other things. And so we have memory against the specific coronavirus spike protein that is used to protect us from disease. I'm not going to go through this, just to let you know that there are 4 phases of every biological that's approved by the FDA, from the preclinical through the surveillance stage, which is what we're in with all 3 of the vaccines that are approved. They go through this. Usually it takes about 5 years because we use a lot lower numbers of people. But for these, because of the emergency, many more people, 30,000 and 60,000 people were used in the clinical studies to make sure the data for efficacy and safety was solid. And so they've gone through all of these steps through cooperation of scientists and government and clinical and physician people. And so what can I tell you about the vaccines that you really need to know? These are the 3 that are approved. 2 of them are messenger RNA vaccines that require 2 injections to get full immunity or full protection. They're very, very effective at blocking disease. They may not block infection, but they block the ability of the virus to make you sick after both doses. The virus, the J&J or Johnson & Johnson, is a virus vector that's 67 to 85% effective in 1 dose. And it seems to also work against the variants. With all of these, we don't know if they block infection, but we do know they block disease. We do know with all of them, you can have side effects. Some people have some people have none. But remember, the side effects are saying that your immune system, your wonderfully, fearfully made immune system is working because it's seeing something foreign and preparing to fight against that if it should ever see that again. In all of these, we still have to do the preventions after vaccination. And then when you do get your vaccine, hopefully you register it with vSafe, because this is how data is collected to make sure the vaccines are doing what they're supposed to do, or they're not making you more sick. That's how we discovered that the Johnson & Johnson may have been causing some rare symptoms in young women. And then there's the vaccine adverse reporting systems, which our doctors report things to, or clinicians. So in summary, vaccines block COVID-19 disease and death. There are symptoms of COVID that occur. COVID-19 can have no symptoms or be all the way from mild to severe illness to death. But if you get the vaccine, they block against the illness and death, even though some people still can get infected and have symptoms. If you get it or you don't, whatever vaccine you get, you still have to use the public health preventions. Right now, the peak that we see, the surge that we see, is due mostly to people who get exposed to virus and are unvaccinated. So they end up with severe illness or death from the virus because they have no protections against it. All right, so very quickly then, I want to tell you about COVID, because I told you about the vaccines, but what is COVID protecting us against? Or the COVID vaccines protecting us against? I hear a lot of people say, oh, I just want to get it and get it over with. I'm not going to get that vaccine. Just let me get the virus. Well, this virus is very, very dangerous. Let me show you why. So we know it's easy to transmit from anyone who gets infected, putting out all those progeny into the air when they breathe in or talk or sing or exercise or do anything that puts air into the environment, which is why we need to stay at least 6 feet away from people. If there's a mask, this clearly reduces the amount going into the environment. When it goes into the environment and somebody within 6 feet breathes it in, it goes into the nasal passages and begins to make more virus in the tissue here. And then it ultimately travels down the throat and trachea into the lungs, all the way to our little small air sacs called alveoli in the body. We can also touch a surface and self-inoculate ourselves. Ultimately, it can lead to pneumonia in some people. What is pneumonia? What is progression to pneumonia? Well, it's when these air sacs, which are normally open, that exchange oxygen and CO2 like just tiny balloons that are open. When we get infected and our immune system kicks in and the virus is reproducing, there's mucus that clogs up these air sacs. So we end up with swelling and reduced airflow. We can't get oxygen in, we can't get CO2 out, and ultimately fluid begins to build up in the lung. So impaired lung function restricts oxygen and ultimately not only affects the lungs, but other organs, because we can't get oxygen to those organs or get the toxins out that naturally go out in breathing. So there are a wide effect of COVID-19 for some 20% of the people who get infected previously, and now even more because most of the people getting infected are unvaccinated. So brain effects, strokes, blood clots, neurological issues, lungs, as we've heard, there are lung clots and embolisms and blood clots. Pneumonia, there's heart arrhythmias and heart attacks due to the clots that form. And we don't understand the underlying things the virus does to cause all these things. Kidneys damage, even people who recover from COVID often have to go on dialysis. There's purple toes and purple fingers and rashes. The immune system can be overactive. There can be vomiting and diarrhea from GI tract issues, blood clotting in many places. And some of the milder symptoms are simply losing the taste of smell or taste, which many people who don't get seriously ill have, or pink eye. When it's very serious, people go to the hospital and the first thing that's done is try to get oxygen into their body and support them through the time that their body is fighting against COVID. If that works, they survive. If it doesn't, they may die. And then there's something called long hauler syndrome, where people who have mild COVID, who don't go to the hospital, have long-term 2 to 3 to 4 months to 6 month symptoms, fatigue, inability to sleep, vertigo, chest pain, joint pain, skin rash, being really, really tired. And even some people who get serious COVID, when they recover, still have some of these symptoms. So we don't understand how the virus does these things. But the vaccines, the 3 vaccines we have, protect against COVID disease. That's the thing I want you to understand. They may not protect against infection, but they protect against serious COVID disease. And so here's a summary of the vaccines. Both Pfizer and Moderna have 2 doses. They're messenger RNA. They block disease. There are different conditions, which you've heard about. Pfizer can be used down to age 12. They're 21 days or 28 days apart, and they all 3 put the spike protein only into the body. No DNA, doesn't change your genes, none of that stuff. There are side effects. Some people see some or 1 or 2 of these. Some people see none of them, but they only last for 2 to 3 days. And what we're doing is priming the immune system such that it has memory, such that when it actually sees the spike protein, it already has antibodies and memory cells that can collapse onto that spike and make it incapable of attaching to cells. So in order for this to work, we need high buy-in. In order to get out of this pandemic, or at least to get it to a manageable place, we need community engagement, we need access, which is getting better. We need inclusion of diverse populations. We need the scientists to be transparent. We need clear messaging. We need trusted messengers, all to build trust so that people will work together to get this done. So what are the takeaways? The takeaways are pandemics occur. They occur, they have occurred, they will occur. We'll probably get more of them because humans are coming more in contact with microbes. And so with the human, animal, and environment that's adaptable, some of these animal viruses will be moving into humans. Getting out of the COVID-19 pandemic will require consistent, wide use of all preventions available. And that means we need to layer on those preventions. You have to make informed decisions as to when to do what. Do you go to a concert? Is something indoor or outdoor? Do you gather your family together for a family reunion? Do you go to a wedding? Do you have that reception inside or outside? And then thirdly, we all need to make and implement infection prevention plans, whether we get the vaccine, and I hope that everyone who can will, because it's really critical in blocking disease and clogging up our hospitals, such that even people who need just regular things like appendicitis or broken leg or a kidney transplant or whatever can still get their medical treatment. With or without the vaccine, we still need to do the preventions. We still need to layer the available preventions, not gather, be aware of where we are and what we're doing, and then model and expect others to comply to the things that will help get us out of the pandemic. In short, we have 6.8 billion people on this planet, and pandemics will happen. COVID is present globally, with now in the US, some 1 out of 500 people have died of COVID as of this month. And so pandemics happen, but so are religious leaders around the world. Microbes are global, religious leaders are global. If we can get religious leaders informed, you can make all the difference in the world. These are some resources that are available for you on YouTube, which talk about COVID-19, what I just showed you, or what COVID unveiled in terms of health disparities, or guidelines for when to open your church and how to open it, and other things here from the AME Health Commission. So with that, I'll end with asking you, won't you be my neighbor? Meaning, let's take care of each other. We are in this together, and I look forward to the questions and answers as we get to those. The point here is that we are all in this process together. The more you know, and I know that was a lot of information, but hopefully it gives you a firm foundation of science upon which everything else can build. And you can always go back. I trust this video will be available from MTSO. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fuller, for your very in-depth presentation, not only on what COVID is, on pandemics themselves, and how religious leaders have always had responses to pandemics when they have occurred. And so what we're going to do now is ask Dr. Cleaver a few questions about how he responded when COVID-19, when we first realized that we were going to enter into lockdown. Basically, how did he make decisions? What type of sources and people did he get in touch with? And also, were you actually in conversation with healthcare professionals during that time?
Yeah, so, when we found out, I forgot what day it was in March or maybe early February. We started before there was a shutdown. We said, okay, we're no longer going to do shaking of hands and all of these things, where we were still learning about COVID-19. But it was that next Sunday, so we shut down pretty quick. It was like the next week after, we really started hearing about it. Thankfully, we were already streaming worship online, so that was helpful. But we were instantly in communication with health professionals. We have several in the congregation, and we put together a coronavirus task force made up of professionals and those a part of the worship team. And they were the ones in consultation, of course, with the health department here in Kansas City to determine when we would go back into the sanctuary. We did not rush anything. We had a few deaths as a result of coronavirus and several members who were sick. So there wasn't a loud cry for us to come back into the building. So we did take our time. And as things started progressing and, the lockdown, and then here in Kansas City, they lifted, I forgot the date, but we still just listened to whatever the health department, what suggestions they gave, as well as our coronavirus task force. People were asking me, and I said, hey, I am just a pastor. I don't know about diseases. So I'm simply listening to the medical professionals. And when they say it's okay, then we'll come back. So we did that throughout the pandemic, and we're back in worship, but we have to, right now people are registering so that we know everyone who's there. We're only doing about 25% capacity so that people are spread out. You don't sit with anyone unless you came with them. We still require masks, and we take temperatures at the door. Hand sanitizer everywhere, although, we know it's still, airborne. We're still doing all of those things. So mostly people are worshiping online, and we've had a few people ask, when we can open things back up. And my response is always the same. We're listening to the medical professionals. You want to know what the Bible says? I'll tell you. If you want to know about the coronavirus, we're going to listen to the professionals. And so that's what we've done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. One of the things I'm sure that you have run up against a lot of times is misinformation and confusion around COVID origins, around vaccines, around a lot of different things. So I already kind of have an idea what you're going to say as an answer, but I'm going to ask this question anyway. How have you responded to these stories?
I share with people, please pay attention who you're listening to. As Dr. Fauci became a household name and one of the leading experts, I just tried to help people understand you need to be mindful of where you get your information. And actually, I've been saying that to people even before the pandemic, because so many people get information from online and all of these sources that aren't always credible. I actually had a sermon about it, how ignorance is contagious. The coronavirus is contagious, but so is ignorance. And it spreads rapidly. It spreads online, it spreads on radio, on TV. So really just being mindful of who we're listening to. In terms of the vaccine, there is a lot of suspicion within the Black community, and rightfully so. There is a history that we just can't ignore. So we had several conversations about, how reliable is the pandemic. I think once, President and some of our elected officials received the vaccine, of course, we had people saying, well, I want that vaccine, no other. I want the one that they got. So it was helpful when people that they trust get the vaccine. And so we were able to host we were a vaccine site and had a few thousand people receive the vaccine. Working with Truman Medical Center here in Kansas City. And that's a partnership that we've had and we continue to have. And so when the pastors got the vaccine, I think it eased a lot of people that they, realized that they could get it as well. There was a lot of misinformation about it. Some people pointed to the Bible, specifically to the book of Revelation. Well, I heard that it was the mark of the beast if you get it and all of that. And so just really doing a lot of educating around that. Of course, some people talked about, their personal freedom, not wanting to have the mask. And so I share, Jesus had an opportunity to do what he wanted to do. But he said to the Father, not my will, your will. And so he could have looked out for himself and did what, his independence, but he looked out for the larger community. And so I asked the question, when does our personal freedom have to take a back door to what's best for society? if we're calling ourselves followers of Jesus, that's exactly what he did. He put his personal preference aside so that he would do what was best for the larger society. And so just sharing things like that to try to help people understand personal freedom is one thing, but what's best for the larger society is what we've been called to do as followers of Christ.
Okay, thank you so much for giving us those stories, and also for telling us more about the types of public health partnerships that you already had in place, but that you knew you could go to when we ran into the pandemic crisis. I want to go back and talk to Dr. Schneider specifically about something that Dr. Cleaver just brought up, which is trust building among scientists and medical professionals, specifically in BIPOC communities. Given that we have these histories of scientific exploitation and medical neglect, what have you found from your research on public health and African American churches?
Yeah, thank you. I'm so humbled and honored to be here with everyone today, and Dr. Fuller and Dr. Cleaver. It's just such a privilege to hear from both of you. In some ways, I feel a little bit inadequate to this task, but I have done some research in my role with Rice's Religion and Public Life program. We did a pre-pandemic study that was looking at religion and inequality in science education, and part of that involved doing focus groups with Black pastors in Houston, as well as with congregants. And, you know, one of the things that I think is so important to be aware of, so, you know, this was pre-pandemic, but I think just impacts even more so during the pandemic. One of the things that's really important to really be aware of in terms of public health researchers or people from the medical and science community, and Dr. Cleaver already spoke to this, but is the realities of medical racism and this historic context. So we found that Black pastors and congregants see the gatekeeping role as vital because there is an awareness of this history. And, you know, it is important that they be trusted messengers, as Dr. Fuller mentioned, but there's this awareness of this history of exploitation. In Tuskegee, for example, the way that they accessed the people that were exploited was through exploiting that authority that pastors had, and they used churches as clinics that ended up, you know, really damaging people. And so there is like a real, like, often we're talking about how pastors, you know, may be reticent or are not, you know, there's all this popular discussion about our pastors, you know, serving public health, are they hindering it? But I think it's so important, especially in the context of Black churches, to understand the context behind this gatekeeping role, and that there is an expectation that they're going to protect their communities and that they're trusted in the communities. And so researchers really need to acknowledge that, not treat it as a problem, but as a dynamic that then there needs to be reparative action and care and sensitivity around, and not undermining that authority, but doing the extra work to earn trust and build those partnerships for collaboration, which often means demonstrating a real commitment to the well-being of the community, and, you know, beyond just the narrow, what am I trying to get done, but a real sense of awareness of the systemic issues and the structural issues impacting the communities, but also how is what I want going to actually benefit others, and really demonstrating that to pastors.
Thank you for that. I wanted to follow that up with a question about the gatekeeping and the connectors to the outside. And if you could speak more about how you really talk about the tensions between the priestly and the prophetic roles of pastors, especially when it comes to helping congregants to engage science knowledge as well as health resources.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one thing that's really important to understand about the Black church, and again, I know I'm speaking to as somewhat of an outsider, but that just Black churches have played such an important historic community role. And there really is this priestly and prophetic function. So priestly function, you know, attending to the spiritual care of church members and also engaging with their everyday survival, and then the prophetic functions of really intervening and being aware of and engaged with these issues of larger community concern. And so there's always this balancing and this tension. That's what we found in our research with pastors and congregants, a balance and a tension between these two. They shouldn't be seen as opposition because both work together to support well-being, but sometimes they can work in tension with one another. And I'll tell you what I mean. So, you know, with gatekeeping, for example, when we talked to pastors, you know, they took really seriously their responsibility in terms of protecting the community prophetically. You know, they tied that to gatekeeping and the need to gatekeep. But and they recognized that if they let someone into the church who ended up causing harm or was disrespectful or insensitive, that could actually undermine their authority as priestly leaders, to have that spiritual authority, that their credibility and their integrity would be compromised, because congregants expected them to vet people and to only let in good people, essentially. And then when they play the connector role, so not only do pastors play a really significant role in who comes in, they also play a role in how things are accessed outside of the church. So what knowledge and resources are, they can legitimate things or they can delegitimate things. And so with that connector role, you know, what we found is that pastors, Black pastors on the whole that we interviewed, were really positive to science because they saw it as a resource that could help their communities, and that could, you know, they cared about the spiritual and physical health of their church members. But when it comes to connecting, there is a sense too that you have to also be willing to admit that something's beyond your expertise. Dr. Cleaver spoke to this. Reverend Cleaver, you know, this is my area, this is not my area. Consult with a medical professional. And so sometimes, you know, that went counter to a culture in the church where pastors were seen as godlike, everything that they, you know, I can only trust what pastor says. Or in many cases, congregants saw pastors as their first resource, especially around mental health kinds of issues. So there is a sense that the pastors wanted to encourage, to try to create a culture where they were encouraging critical questions. But then in that, they also have to be willing to say, I don't know everything. And that again kind of can touch up against, you know, how they want to be viewed in the context of the church. And also how people want to view them, even if they don't want to be viewed that way, how people want to view them. And then the final thing I would say is that in being a connector or a gatekeeper, what we really also found was that pastors want resources and they want to access resources. They want the resources to benefit their communities, but also they're often really overwhelmed because of these priestly and prophetic functions. That's a lot to hold. And I think white church communities don't, and maybe outsiders don't always understand all of the roles that pastors play, particularly within the Black community and communities of color generally, when many church members are also often facing so many structural injustices and disparities. And so they're overwhelmed. And so I think that can also impact how, you know, impact partnerships and collaboration. So anything that health people can do to alleviate some of that pressure while also being respectful and sensitive and aware of these histories, I think will be welcome, as long as they, in the words of one of our pastors, don't make the pastor look bad.
Okay. Okay. Well, we are right at 8 o'clock, and so we are doing excellent with our time. I want to go to some of our questions that we have from our audience. And I also want to say, any of our panelists, if you have questions for one another, also feel free to ask them. We have our first question is basically about someone who is not able to get vaccinated. So it says, I know someone who has factor V, thus they are more likely to get blood clots, and they are not able to be vaccinated. What are their options for the vaccine, and what are potential side effects? Now, this would be more for Dr. Fuller. If I'm not sure.
If I put on my pastor hat and my virology researcher hat, I would say, well, I'm not sure the answer to this, but I think I do have an answer, even though I'm not a clinician. And that is that there are some percentage of people in the population who cannot get vaccines, period. People who don't get flu vaccines or anything else because of either what's being issued or what's being said or other things. So that person certainly needs to confer with their physician or private care person about their condition to make sure that they should or should not get this vaccine because of blood clots. The thing that I also add is that COVID infection can lead to blood clots. And if somebody who's already has a tendency to do that, they may be more prone to have serious blood clots. So that's why I think they and their health provider need to carefully evaluate what to do in this situation. And then the other piece is that that's why it's so important that all the rest of us who can get vaccinated do so, because if we get the population high enough that's vaccinated, then the virus levels go down because the virus has no place to go to reproduce, thereby protecting the people who cannot get vaccinated like this, if this is the case for the person with factor V. So that's a won't you be my neighbor kind of thing, where we're all not only protecting ourselves, but protecting those in the community, like the children now under 12 who can't get vaccinated. So check with their health advisor, because we don't have a clinician here that can really address that.
Okay. Our next question is from Balarami Melosi. And it says, how can we as clergy advocate for vaccination in our churches without discriminating against people who are still discerning whether or not to take the vaccine?
Well, I mean, the best that we can do is, I share why I got the vaccine and my rationale behind it. So just sharing my personal story and sharing the story of others. I don't believe I've pressured anyone who doesn't feel like they ought to get the vaccine or they're still unsure about it. But all I can do is just share why I've done it and why perhaps some others have found it necessary to get the vaccine.
If I
May I
can
take
add.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, you do, and then I'll come if there's anything left.
Okay, I'll just add a quick more observation or anecdotally, and this is from some of the, so I've been doing interviews with pastors for other research projects while the pandemic unfolded. So we ended up asking questions. And one of the things that we heard from a lot of, I know I just talked about the Black church, but a lot of particularly white pastors, was that they were very hesitant to speak about COVID or vaccines or anything, because they felt like it was it was so politicized and could create divisions, and they didn't, but also that they saw it as not a personal issue. And so I think some of the things that Dr. Cleaver said are so important for like how we discuss this, because I think that there is, and Dr. Fuller, you also mentioned like looking at these models of how religious leaders have historically and even in early Christianity been actively involved, and how this is a body issue collectively, and framing it within our like deepest principles of care for others. But I sort of puzzles me, because I think maybe there needs to be more of an ethic of courage and really making a case within the faith tradition for our collective health.
And thank you. I was just going to add that in terms of pressure, what we often say, so I do encourage everybody that can to get the vaccine. And the reason is because I make this analogy, COVID is nothing to play with. There are people who said that, I'll just get it and get natural immunity. Well, we know natural immunity is not as strong as the vaccine, because, and I'll give this analogy, the virus, if my hand is the virus, when we get infected, we make responses to the whole thing. And some of those don't even matter, right? I mean, it's like they're wasted. Whereas when we get the vaccine, we only get, make antibodies to the thumb, or immune system to the thumb. And the thumb is what attaches the virus to the cell. So this is a very powerful response. And so getting infected gives one the danger of getting COVID, which for some people may be mild, but for some people may be severe. And even if I get infected and mine is mild, that means I'm making more virus that goes into the air, that somebody who might get it, who might be immunosuppressed, who might get a serious disease or might die, because I'm helping to keep the virus going. So it's not a pressure thing. It's trying to inform people why, as both of my colleagues have said, is that we are in this thing together. It's not just about my personal privilege and my individual preferences. I am called to be a citizen of my community, a citizen of the world. And so if I don't do this, I am putting my interests above others, unless there's some medical reason to do that. And because now I'm convinced, after it's rolled out into millions of people around the world, billions of people, that, well, at least millions of people, that it is relatively safe, right? As safe as anything we know. I mean, when I say relatively, I don't know what's going to happen in 20 years, but we didn't know that with polio vaccine. We didn't know that with smallpox vaccine. So I am convinced that a citizen of the world who follows the model of Jesus, as was mentioned, will care enough about his or her neighbor to get over their personal preferences, pray about it, and then say, I'm going to step out on courage and get this vaccine. That's what I did, because I was like, I really don't want to put anything in my body that I don't have to put in my body. But at this point, I think I have to put this in my body. So God, please protect me from anything nobody knows about. And I rolled up my sleeve, put my arm out and rolled up my sleeve.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I think we're called to do.
Okay, thank you, panelists, for that. Our next question comes from Dr. Bridgman, and it is, what would you say to someone who says, I'm healthy, and this vaccine is not medically necessary?
I would say just what I said, that COVID-19 has so many pathologies and ways it can work for the person, or for the person that person can infect. And many people get infected asymptomatically. They don't have any symptoms. They don't know they're making virus, but they can shed it to somebody else and keep the levels high. So I would say to that person, what is your responsibility to the community? And do you really want to take the risk? Because we know that COVID can be like waking up. I've used this analogy, like waking up and you're standing on a train track and you see the train lights down the way, and it's coming towards you. If you stay on the track, well, maybe you're in a dream and you'll wake up and there is no train, but maybe you're not. Maybe you're actually on that train track. And if you don't take a step off, which is using all the protections and vaccine, if you can get vaccine, then you may just get run over by this train, or you may be responsible for somebody else getting run over. And so I would not take the higher known risk, which is COVID-19, compared to the less risk, the almost no risk with the vaccines that have had such a huge impact in our society and with individuals.
Thank
Amen.
you. Oh, are you going to add to that?
Just an amen.
Okay. Our next question is, how as clergy do we respond to the large outspoken backlash of the churches being too political and listening to political science when making decisions of closing in-person worship because of rising cases, or ending up having COVID asymptomatic persons during a worship service?
Well, I can share what I've done. I said and have said and will continue to say, I'm not listening to any Republican. I'm not listening to any Democrat. I'm simply listening to the medical community. So it's not a political issue unless you're taking advice from politicians. So I would say block out what all the politicians have said, whether you're Republican or Democrat, and listen to the medical community. We take our cues from Kansas City Health Department, period. Not the mayor, not the governor or anyone else, but the health department.
Okay.
And you can also see the data for yourself that when it's safe to be a little bit more open because the levels are low, that's typically below 5% of the cases, the tests coming back, or better yet, below 3% of the cases of the tests coming back negative or coming back positive. So there's not much virus circulating. The health department keeps those stats for every community. And we encourage leaders to know what the stats are in their community by partnering or looking at the data from the health department, because that tells you when the risk is high or when it's lower, that somebody's going to be around asymptomatically producing virus. So be informed. And that's what I think our pastor is saying here, that's where he gets his information. It's very unfortunate that this was politicized from the beginning, but that doesn't mean we have to keep it up. It is not a political issue. It's a medical life or death biological issue.
Yeah, I don't ask my mechanic what the weather is going to be. I check with the meteorologist. And I don't ask the meteorologist to check my car. In the same way, I'm not going to check with politicians about a medical issue.
Amen.
You know, just today I heard someone talking about a pastor telling their congregants not to wear masks to church. Has anyone heard this story? And I just was very surprised, you know, that would be going on right now. But anyway, definitely check with your public health department. If you have medical professionals in the congregation, please use them as resources to assist you in making decisions. And so we'll move on to our next question, which is from Crystal Fox. She says, I heard part of the report stating that the US is about 3 months behind Israel in the course of the pandemic. Israel's cases are seriously rising. Again, despite the fact that they have the highest ratio of vaccinated people. Is this true? And what does this mean for us in the US?
I have not looked at the data lately at that level. As some of you know, there's an FDA meeting tomorrow. So I've kind of been with my head in the sand when it comes to the news. But we do know that the vaccines are one tool in stopping COVID, and that just like flu vaccines don't last forever, we don't expect that a COVID vaccine is going to last forever. So I think, unfortunately, there has been a bit of mismanagement or expectations about the vaccines. They are not the end all. They're not like the smallpox vaccine or the measles vaccine or the polio vaccine. You get the vaccine, you're protected for life because those viruses don't change. Coronavirus is a new animal, a new species. We don't know it yet. We don't understand it yet. So the prediction is that we're going to have to get another vaccine or a booster at some point, whether that's 8 months or 2 years or 10 years remains to be seen. The data are being collected now. So what's happening in Israel may be a forerunner of what it will happen here, but it may not be. And I say may not be because the United States is not a homogeneous population with homogeneous ideas. When Israel went through the Delta surge, or Great Britain went through the Delta surge, they were not in an open school time. They were not in everybody returning to school time. So magically for Great Britain and India, Delta variant went down in terms of its cases, but it wasn't in the same phase in America where we are now at a place where households are mixing more. We're at a place where we've just opened up and we all had wonderful, or some people had wonderful events in the summertime. So we do not know. I am the first to say scientists do not know what's going to happen. If you read articles, you'll hear 3 or 4 different scenarios of whether we're going to stay flat or go up or go down. We don't know. So the best thing that each of us can do is our best to make sure we're not the ones that's given the virus an opportunity to replicate and to mutate into an even more dangerous variant than Delta. We just don't know. And so we're all in this big biological experiment together. Scientists trying to use the methods that we know, are trying to do the best we can in a situation that's fluid. And so that's the best we can tell you. We don't know what's going to happen because the conditions in America are very different than the conditions that were in Israel or India or Great Britain.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think I had one more question. It was a general question for all of the panelists. And it was that some would say that we have a transformation underway as far as facing multiple pandemics, the COVID pandemic and the pandemic of racism and racial inequality. So how can pastors cultivate resilience during these 2 pandemics? And this is an open question.
Well, you know, the virus of racism has been around, so it's nothing new. It is something that in many congregations, specifically Black churches, it has been addressed and continues to be addressed. You know, and that's more of addressing some of the systemic issues that we have in this country. And, you know, the Black church has been at the forefront of fighting injustice for centuries. And so this is nothing new. And so it's something that we continue to do. I think one thing that we see now is there are several allies that have really joined the fight. And there have always been allies, you know, dating back when we, even to the time of slavery. So it's something that we continue to talk about, that we don't give up on. You know, I've heard people say that, you know, racism will always be around. And I always question that because it wasn't always around. And if it wasn't always around, there was a time where we didn't have racism as we know it today, then there's still the hope and possibility that we can eliminate it. And I think, of course, it takes time, resiliency, and just continuing to push on in this fight for justice and equality. At the same time, of course, just sharing in terms of the pandemic, I think, you know, listening to the medical professionals, I would urge everyone who's able to get the vaccine to do so, because, you know, it's really a part of our DNA as Christians. If we look at Jesus on the cross and we believe that the blood he shed was the vaccine for the virus of sin, And in the same way, there's a vaccine for this virus, the COVID-19. And so it's a part of who we are, is to rely on the vaccine to eliminate deadly viruses.
And some do that forever, like smallpox. Some do that for a short period of time, and some we don't know. I think the resilience comes from the fact, for me, that this is not going to be the last time we have a new, we call these emerging viruses, emerging microbes. They come from human beings moving into territory that previously was deeply forested or where animal habitats were. So we're going to see more of this sort of thing. And this is the first one that we've seen in the world since we've had all the technology where we can see what's going on so rapidly. But imagine 1918, a lot of churches, some of you know, celebrated the 100th anniversary around 2018, right? Because those churches were founded between 1918 and 1920 when people were going through the influenza pandemic. And so now they've survived for 100 years and we're celebrating their 100th anniversary. Well, they didn't have the technology we have to be able to communicate how fast this spread around the world. We will see others, and so the resilience to understand the role that the faith leaders play in the community, the intersectedness between medical and science and religion, as this series is talking about, is so essential. Instead of us saying, oh, here's science and here's religion, never the twain should meet. As a matter of fact, they don't talk to each other. That's just not true. I'm both, and the more I know about science, the more it turns me to God, and vice versa. There's so many things that science can never explain, because for me, there is a divine presence that is what it is. So I think the resilience comes from being the wonderful human beings made in the image of God, which is a spirit that's inquisitive, but also reaching out to our brothers and sisters and being open to whatever is needed, that we all come through it together. And I think that's the resilience that the Bible speaks about, and the resilience that we are called to today, without politics or any of that, just really being one another's, our brother's keeper and sister's keeper.
Wow, both of what you've just shared is amazing. And I would just say, taking off my academic hat and putting on my the work that I do with this organization, Project Curate, we really do a lot of work around racial equity here in Houston, and we work with faith communities. And, you know, during the beginning of the COVID-19 event, we kind of rallied to hold this online webinar that was about, much like this one, that was titled Farewell to Innocence. And part of it was just really inspired by the Black theologian Alan Bozak, who wrote this incredible book in the late 70s called Farewell to Innocence, about the apartheid system. And I really think, you know, as a white Christian myself, I really think that there is the call and the combination of, I guess we can call it, these two pandemics, one very, very old and long and enduring, of anti-Blackness and, you know, and racism, and then also the recognition that this COVID-19 pandemic, we have to say farewell to innocence in the sense of this COVID-19 pandemic is not impacting all communities equally. And I think it's every Christian community's responsibility to recognize that and to really care for those who are most vulnerable and most impacted by every dimension of this pandemic. Health-wise, yes, but we might also think about all the economic impacts as well, and mental health impacts. And so, you know, there's also been efforts to do mutual aid here in Houston, and spearheaded by our Black Lives Matter Houston, where HTX, where they really set up, partnering with Curate, like these networks where we could get resources to people directly. So I think the resilience and the beauty of what I've been seeing during this time is that the overall shared sense of vulnerability has maybe opened up people to reckoning and wrestling with the ways that we have what certain communities have been more vulnerable than others. And we've been really grappling with this real sense that we have to address. We have to heal, we have to repair, and we have to recognize the conditions that make us more vulnerable to harm, that perpetuate harm, and work to intervene in them. So I really see that work happening on a congregational level and really in local context.
Well, our time is nearly up. I know it went so fast. Unless there's any last remarks any of you would like to make, I want to really thank all of you for your thoughtful answers. I want to thank you for sharing your stories and also sharing how you made partnerships. I want to thank Dr. Fuller for telling us what is COVID. What is mRNA? And
You said that very well.
what is messenger RNA and how to have a long view of pandemics. I know when COVID first started, we all thought, oh, this, we can buckle down and get through this, but really making that shift in our thinking, as Dr. Schneider said, having a loss of innocence, saying goodbye to innocence, and hello to really girding ourselves and getting ready for a much longer coexistence with COVID. So
I have just a couple of things that I put into the chat as resources. We're talking about knowing what to do. There's a CDC website, a COVID tracker website where you can go in and look at what's happening in your county. I think I can, like, if I do this right, if the technology works, can you see my screen? That's what's showing there. So there's a link where you can go in and put your state and your zip code, and your county will come up to give you the levels of transmission in your county, where you can make the kinds of decisions that Dr. Cleaver mentioned that his COVID task force is making in Kansas City. And then it also gives you places where you can vaccinate. Then there's also a link in the chat for, you were asking about racial disparities that were unveiled. There's a discussion in a series called Race in Medicine, which is looking at what COVID-19 unveiled. I might be able to show this. Yeah, here we go. There it is. Look at that. I'm managing this technology on the spot. So this is in the chat. This is a very interesting conversation in a series. This one is between me and a New York City physician who was in the clinics during the time that COVID happened. And then we've taken many of those, this was 90 minutes, we've taken many of those and made very short videos that are on YouTube. And then lastly, the AME Health Commission has resources for clergy and leaders as guides for the things that Dr. Cleaver talked about. When do you know to open your church? How do you do the temperature checks? And what supplies do you need to have on hand? So I advise people to use all those resources that are available.
okay. Thank you, Dr. Fuller. Thank you, Dr. Schneider. Thank you, Dr. Cleaver. And we will see you in our next installment of this series of Science and Religion Digital Dialogues. Good night.